Thank you very much. Welcome. I know you've had a long day, and a long 2 days, but a productive day. I'm James Naughtie, and it's an enormous pleasure to be here to bring this conference to an end, this discussion. I feel privileged to be here for various reasons, but particularly since I'm aging myself. Well, we all are. But we understand that this is about the future, not about the past. And it's lovely to see you in the Oval, which is an extraordinary place, to talk to three people who have been embedded in the conversations you've had in the last 48 hours, and who care about the future deeply from an academic and a personal point of view. And I would ask you to welcome them with me. I mean, we're going to have, I hope, a pretty good conversation in which you can join. You know that you can send questions in, and I will see them on the iPad, and if they're ghastly, I will just ignore them. If they're good, I will do what is necessary. Andrew Scott, I'm not going to go through long Wikipedia entries, because it's absolutely ludicrous, because you know where they are. Andrew Scott is here, and his economic analysis and all this stuff is very well known and extraordinary. Helena, you know from your conversations in the last hours, and Bertha, you also know, who's going to give us that extra depth. So I'm just going to set them off, basically, and talk about the future. So I think rather than giving some ghastly introduction which goes on forever, which is always preceded by, they need no introduction, but. So I'm not going to give them. Listen, Helena, start off. What do you take from the last 2 days? Where do you go?
Sure. So I've been here today, and I think there's two or three things that have struck me. First of all, and this is quite an important one, a lot of energy in the room and a lot of focusing on what we can all do. I think there is so much that is challenging at the moment in terms of pressures on public services, the narrative around ageing, which is often negative. So I've been really delighted and inspired by the positive approaches. And I think one of my favourite parts of today, actually, was I went to listen to some of the innovation pitches of the companies and organisations that are designing and developing new products. And it was very exciting because it felt like I was seeing the inside of Dragon's Den. But it was also great to hear how people were looking at issues of ageing that have been around a long time and just trying to bring a different perspective to it. So that's been good. In my role as the Independent Older People's Commissioner for Wales, I have a remit set out in law to protect and promote the rights of older people and to engage with older people on how to do that. And I think the second thing that struck me today is that the approaches that appear to be the most successful are done with older people, not to older people. And I think there's probably more that needs to be done there.
What's the experience in Wales, from your point of view, being on that?
So in Wales, I think one of the things we're very strong at is that engagement, actually. So as Commissioner, part of my responsibilities are to make sure that I'm out and about and listening to older people or connecting with them online if they can't get out and about. And that is so important to make sure that we don't develop new approaches to healthy ageing that ignore people's real lived experience.
What difference does that make to what people call policy making?
Oh, it makes a massive difference. So
give us an example.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. So a really direct example is it's about the concessionary bus pass. And here's the thing, in Wales, you can get the concessionary bus pass when you're 60. That's because at the point at which the Welsh Government was looking to increase the age to the state pension age, I put the case drawn from older people, drawn from people who are caring, about why it shouldn't increase. So the direct impact is we still have a concessionary bus pass at the age of 60, and that means that people can afford to use public transport, can stay healthy, can stay volunteering, can stay in work, can stay doing if they've got an unpaid caring role, for example. The other thing I'd point to, though, is the way in which the issue of older people's rights is embedded in Welsh Government's strategy for an ageing society. Now, what is important about that is, first of all, Wales has a strategy for an ageing society. England does not have that, but it has rights at the heart of it, and our rights do not diminish as we age, and we need to make sure, indeed in all these conversations and discussions, that we're not assuming somehow that our rights do diminish as we age, and that's why this issue about working with and not to is so important.
Bertha, let me bring you in at this point. I mean, listening to that, you know, one of the devolved administrations, what's the lesson that needs to be taken for perhaps the UK as a whole?
I think one of the lessons that we need to be looking at is that the healthy aging does not start at 65 or 60 or even 40. It actually starts from early years, from even preconception, preconception to when a baby is born.
Making me feel very, very old. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
And a lot of my work is very much intergenerational. And I think once we acknowledge the fact that healthy aging starts much more earlier, and some of the challenges that we are seeing that we've been talking about for the last 2 days now are actually embedded from childhood into adolescent, into young adult. I thought that's something that was quite profound when I'm listening to the conversation for the last 2 days, and why it is so important to have that life course approach that some of the practitioners and researchers are already implementing going forward. But also critically is that also working with the older adults, for instance, in the ages of 60, 70, and 80, and I've done that a lot of my work. They should not be seen as a burden. You know, they're fiercely independent in terms of the decisions that they make. And a lot of my research has actually highlighted that. And having respect for that and a space for that independence and preparing ourselves for that is actually really important from some of the work that I've done, and also listening to the conversation the last 2 days. There was a lot of use of technology, which at times there's almost an assumption and a stereotype that the older you become, you're using less technology. That's really something that has been challenged within the communities that I work with in terms of the older adult. But yes, that life was approach.
I'll come to Andrew in a moment on the economic background to this. But since this is a session dedicated to hope rather than despair, how have things changed, in your view, in the way that people look at the whole territory you've been describing in the last, 10 years?
10 years. Having this conversation itself actually is a lot of hope, and having the acknowledgement that not only are we living longer, but things are changing also. So in the past, we would not, for instance, I've worked in health and social care for more than 20 years. We would not be having such a conversation. So I think this gives me a lot of hope. And also when you look at the policies and the changes in policies that we are now seeing, where we are developing policies that are bridging healthcare and the social determinants of health, there's a lot of policies in that particular area. And having that local knowledge is really important, and that gives me a lot of hope with regards to going forward. Yeah.
Andrew, to bring you in at this point as the third member of the panel, to what extent do you think the understanding of this question has entered the, if you like, the economic social debate?
I think they got it wrong, or certainly incomplete. So at least in the economic world, there's a lot of talk of an aging society. And I think the word in economics is used differently from perhaps here. That aging society story is about a change in the age structure of the population. Fewer people being born, more people living longer, so we just have more old people. And that's always just seen as a problem. You know, old people, they don't work, they get ill, it's a problem with pensions and health, and the economy is going to go down. It's a strange way, I think, of looking at one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, but we'll put that to one side. What I think needs to be brought into the economics, and perhaps more broadly socially, and picking up on what you were saying, is we have to focus on what I call a longevity society, which is we're living for longer. The big change now is that the young and middle age can expect to become the old. That's never really happened before. Yes, there's always been older people, but there's always been a minority. And we sort of, as a society, tend to underestimate the capacity of older people and of our later years, which is why this conference is called Adding Life to Years.
Yes.
But rather than focus on a change in the age structure, we had to focus on changing how we age. And that, of course, I think brings us straight into economics, because we have a concept of age chronological, which isn't, I think, economically a very interesting variable. I think there's two much more interesting variables in economics. One is prospective age, which is how much longer can you expect to live. And so I'm 58, and as a 58-year-old, I'm different from my father at 58 and my grandfather at 58. I have to behave differently. Similarly, we know there's biological age, which we also know is malleable. We just need to look at the inequalities in society around it. And that's, I think, where the economics comes in, because if we can change how we age, it's a very valuable thing to do. And we have to do it because we are living longer, and we have to make sure that that longer life is productive for longer and healthier for longer.
Do you think people, for the sake of argument, in their 30s get this yet? Because it strikes me that there's a psychological corner that has to be turned about people understanding the point you've made, which I don't think they've got yet.
Yes and no, but I agree. It's a very profound one, but of course it's profound, because we're the sort of first time in human history when the young and middle age can expect to become. So to sort of, we're not going to turn on a dime and change things. And then, of course, it's longer term, which is really very hard. But, this is then, you look at those around you, you look at those ahead of you, and you start to mimic their behavior. And this is the social innovation that has to happen. And I think, I'm sure this last 2 days here, there's been lots of talk about social innovation. Some things we're doing we can see that work. Some things we think will work we haven't tried yet. But this is just a massive, big experiment.
Bertha, what cheers you up and what depresses you about the points that Andrew's just made?
I'll start with what depresses me. And what really depresses me is the fact that we are still talking about and experiencing inequalities in health. And those inequalities cut across not just ethnicity, but social class, disability. And if we reflect on the presentation that the Chief Medical Officer shared with us this afternoon, we can actually also see the inequalities in gender. And we know what some of those predisposing factors are that are contributing to the inequalities. But the willingness in terms of having that intervention and acknowledging that is still elusive for some of us. And I think that depresses me. What cheers me about it is the acknowledgement that it actually exists. Let's do something about it. And it makes economic sense to address the inequalities in health. That really cheers me up, because at times there could be some discussion, what do we get out of this one? But it does make a lot of economic sense to actually acknowledge that in terms of going forward. And there are policies and interventions now that are looking at that, and that really cheers me up. And also the fact that when we look at the participants at conference for the last 2 days, because one of the things that I always do is to look around and see who is not in the room, who are we talking to, who needs to be in the room. It is such a diverse room. We're just not speaking to researchers and academics, but there are also commissioners here, there are practitioners here. And I think that is really important, although there's a group of other individuals that I think we should be having in this room. And that perhaps is young people also, who probably will be living for the next 80, 90 years. They need to hear about this and some of the challenges.
It may make economic sense, but how do you persuade people, Helena, to get the point?
It's a challenge, and I think that's partly because there's a fear of growing older in the UK, and I think that's sometimes because people look at how older people are treated or talked about now, and fear fear for what that might mean for them. And that's about ageism. That's the stereotypes, the very negative stereotypes that we have about growing older and about older people. You only need to think about the language that's used. You know, past your sell-by date, can't teach an old dog new tricks. The whole narrative that's around is negative about aging. So we need to change that. And one of the reasons we need to change that is because it doesn't just damage and cause hugely negative consequences for older people, and I think we saw some of that in the pandemic, but it's also a risk to our own futures. Nelson Mandela put it really well, actually. He said, a society that does not value its older people denies its roots and endangers its future. And I think it's that issue about endangering the future as well, if we have these ageist assumptions, if there is age discrimination in the way in which we work. So challenging that, as well as people understanding the economics, I think those two things need to come together.
But if it's true that more people are experiencing in their families or with their close friends a form of dementia or, you know, some kind of decline in mental facility in older years, isn't that talked about more openly, more directly, and more in terms of understanding, better now than it was 20 years ago?
Sure, for sure it is. And I think, you know, there are some positives, definitely. And I think the way in which people will talk about dementia, and one of the things that's really driven that is that we're hearing much more from people living with dementia talking about it.
Yeah.
So if you go to lots of conferences now, it will be people living with dementia saying, this is my life, and by the way, I'm having a good life. So that, again, it's important that we give voice to people who are undergoing those experiences. I think the other frustrating thing, if I may, is that we know so much more now than we did 20 or 30 years ago about how to age well, about how to provide good care, about the importance of prevention, but we're still not doing it, and we're still not doing it consistently enough. So there's some great practice around. There's some brilliant people working in our public services and our voluntary sector caring for older people or caring for each other, but we're just not doing that consistently enough. And I think we're not investing enough in ourselves as an ageing society.
Well, Andrew, from an economic point of view, I mean, the difficulty is that whatever government we have now and whatever government we'll have in 18 months' time, I mean, the room for manoeuvre is so limited. How do you deal with it?
Well, I think that's what's kind of interesting about this whole healthy aging longevity one, which is actually, I think, you can create extra resources if people age better. So, you know, around the world, we're struggling with economic growth. We're looking for good quality economic growth. And I think for me, you know, you talk about what makes us a bit more what makes us optimistic. You know, I've been trying to get ministers of finance and central bank interested in this topic. And over the last few years in the US and the UK, the withdrawal of older workers pre-retirement age, pre-state pension age, has been a first-order macroeconomic issue. Its Central Bank of England thinks it's been a significant contributor to inflation. And suddenly the Treasurer are going, oh, hold on a minute, there's this exit from the labour market from age 50. We're no longer obsessing with can we increase the state pension age, which is much more a complicated issue. But people start to leave the labour market from 50. They do it because they're ill, because they have to care for someone who's ill, because of ageism in the workplace, or because their skills are getting out of date.
Or because they're rich.
Very few people leave the labour market from 50 plus because they're rich. And in fact, you know, a lot of the people working after state pension age are the richest people. So, I mean, it's really not that. So then the question is, the Treasury is saying, hold on a minute, health and education, perhaps if they're not quite yet there, but I think with the push they get there, wow, if I invest in health 50 plus, it's going to increase GDP, it's going to increase employment. And I think that's a real positive. So I think that's the line that I personally have some optimism for. From the pessimistic side, and, you know, and by the way, I think there's also really, I would advise to be a little bit cautious on just focusing on the negatives, because there's lots of things to be positive about. You know, the risk at every age of getting dementia is declining. There's some tremendous breakthroughs happening. In the UK, the 10 years before COVID, 80% of employment growth came from people aged over 55 plus. So there is undoubtedly ageism, but there's something happening in the background that is sort of improving things. But for me, the saddest thing is we saw during COVID that government said, hey, it's really important to focus on health. We'll take steps to lower GDP to keep people alive and keep them healthy. But we're not doing the same thing when it comes to healthy aging. You know, the amounts of money we sort of prepare to lose to support life expectancy in COVID, consistency requires we should be heavily investing in healthy aging, and we're not.
So Bertha, how do you change the public mood on that question?
When we're looking at the public mood, it's always very difficult to measure the public mood, but I think it makes a lot, in terms of some of the work that I'm doing and in the communities that I'm doing, I'm working with, and some of the intergenerational work that I've actually done with families across the board. There's a real understanding there in terms of the contribution of older adults within the society that they're in with. And there's almost a recognition there. When it comes to policy, perhaps that's where there needs to be a real shift with regards to the policy. I know he was talking with Andrew before, and we are talking about the 3 stages of life. You know, you go to school, you work, and then you retire. Who created that? And why can't we challenge that? So within those communities and family units and networks that we are in, there's a real recognition of some of the contribution that older adults make. I certainly came from a background where the older you are, the more we respect you and the more we listen to your voice. And why isn't that the case? Why do we have to retire at this age of 50 or 55? Why can't there be an entitlement of education also at that particular stage, where there's support for individuals to retrain and to move forward? So that's something that perhaps we can, and we can also start shifting by looking at older adults as a burden, but actually looking at some of the positive, not just economic contribution, but the social contribution that they make within the areas that they live in. And I think that is really important when we start talking about those stories. We saw that before the pandemic. We see that also within family setup, where young people choose to live near their parents or grandparents because of the support that they get from them. So I think it's really important, not just the public mood, but there has to be an entitlement of policy and a recognition of policy that there's a real positive that older adults make within the economy that we are working in terms of taking that forward. And it does make, there's a lot of the work that we've done, you know, when they talk about young people going to their parents and grandparents' banks and the support that they are giving, that not just that, but some of the social benefits that you find it very difficult to actually quantify, but it makes a lot of sense with regards to that. Those stories need to come out also.
Working with the Welsh government, Helena, what have you learned about the business of persuading people and making that connect with people who make the decisions in policy?
I think persistence is probably one of the things
Yes.
I've learned. So I think you need to persist. I think the point at which you think you've persuaded is probably the point at which you haven't quite. You need to keep at it. And I think it's about, you know, getting the evidence, getting the data, and getting the stories as well. I think one of the things I've found, and this is true more generally, is that sometimes issues affecting older people are invisible or ignored because the evidence and the data isn't there. And in fact, Professor Chris Whitty talked about this.
You have to prove your point.
Yeah, and talked about the lack of older people involved in research, for example. So some of what I've been doing is making sure that actually the data is there. I mean, just to give you one example quickly, if I may.
Yeah.
One of the areas I'm working on in Wales, and we're making good progress, is about how we can stop older people being abused, so being victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, etc. And until very recently, the England and Wales Crime Survey didn't ask anyone over the age of 74 whether they'd been a victim of abuse. They just didn't ask the question, as if it's somehow you get to 74 and those things
it doesn't matter.
Don't happen, or it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So of course, when you're saying, no, this is happening, and then the question is, well, where's the evidence? So you have to look, and actually sometimes it's about the data and the questions not being asked. And those are political decisions, really, about do we investigate this or not. The England and Wales Crime Survey now doesn't have an upper age limit, and we're starting to get the data through. So I think it is about really drilling down sometimes, getting the evidence, getting the story, making the moral case as well as the economic as well, I think is important. And also, you know, as ever, finding champions and people who really want to make a difference. And, you know, there are some great people in Wales who are doing that.
Andrew, to what extent do you think people's understanding of the change in our demographic is changing? I mean, is it keeping pace with the reality of the changes?
I honestly think most people are aware of an aging society.
Yes.
And it is striking. You know, when I was growing up in London, I would go to family parties and there were loads of cousins, lots of aunts and uncles,
Sure.
not many grandparents, and now it's the other completely other way around. So I think people see that, and so I think they're aware of it. I think what's the great advantage of this topic, speaking as an economist, you know, I'm about trying to get governments and individuals to recognize this is as important as climate change and AI to our future.
Yeah.
But I think one of the challenges we've got is we make it a bit about the other, and we often medicalize aging. This is about life. This is about what you... And once you start talking to anyone about these issues and sort of don't talk it just about care or end of life, it's like, well, how do you want to structure your life? What do you want to do?
Whether we talk about governments or oppositions and potential governments, do they get it?
I think this is an easy trend to get because it's about you, your family.
But do they
your
get
relatives.
it yet?
Do they get the sense that they're living for longer? I think so. No, I don't think they do. I don't think they do.
Yeah,
and
I
do
knew
they get
you
the
were
sense
getting
that
there in
can
the
change
end,
how they age.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that's necessarily... You know, for instance, you can see people behaving differently younger already. People are getting married later, they're having children later, they're buying houses later. You know, my father was never a teenager. He was 14, but teenagers weren't invented at the time he was 14. He went to work, he was sort of paying rent, he married. So we're seeing all sorts of changes happen. People may not be aware of it, but I think there's some social changes already underway. It's early days, so I think you don't always have to be aware of things for social change to happen.
I mean, to ask you a very obvious question, I mean, you're an economist, not a politician, but how important is it for people who are in power now or potentially in the future to talk about this in a way that gets it across?
Enormously important, and again, I think this is something that, you know, I do think people, part of the challenge is that, you know, younger middle-aged people now like to get old and they fear getting old. And then the question which you emphasized, so what do you do now to avoid that?
Yes.
And I think it's that connection that we have to get clear. And I think that's where politicians, influencers, all of us in the room have a role to play, which is that you can influence how you age. And I think that's the thing that we really have to try and grapple with, that we need to accept that we can influence how age. In the past, we've thought, well, I'm not likely to get to 70, 80 or 90. But when the ONS says that a newborn child in England and Wales has a 50% chance of making it to 93, wow, we need to start getting people to recognize that old age is not something that happens, it's not a state, it's a process. Aging is a process and not a state. That's a hard thing to get across, but that, I think, is what we can. And the great thing about it, which is why I hope politicians eventually would do it, is it's a good news story, and there aren't many of those things around. And to turn the fact that we're living for longer and that, you know, fewer children are snatched away in their young life, fewer parents lost in midlife, and more grandparents meeting their grandchildren is turned into a major social problem of the future is really wrong.
One of the interesting things, and it may be a kind of bizarre sidelight on this, is I was in America 3 weeks ago doing some stuff for the BBC. And of course, you've got, you know, the strangest American election coming up for all kinds of weird reasons. The courts, the whole Trump story. The president was going to be 81, he's turning 81, who, you know, can still get in a plane to Israel and talk very cogently and seriously about what's going on there. Trump, who is clearly, we're talking privately here, aren't we? He's clearly losing it. I mean, he can't read his autocue. I mean, he's muddling his words. But the question of age, it's quite an interesting thing. the question of age in the next year, the election is a year last Sunday, is going to be quite a big one. And there's going to be a hell of a lot of discussion about whether Biden's up to it. Now, in a funny way, this touches on exactly what we're talking about. He may or may not be up to it, let's see. But, you know, it puts it absolutely center stage. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've already seen a huge amount of ageism about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anyone else
He's been
watches.
muddling his words for 50 years.
I don't know if anyone else
There's nothing new about that.
watches Have I Got News for You or whatever, but you will see lots of ageist jokes which are seen as perfectly acceptable. In a way, thankfully, you will not now see those sexist jokes or those racist jokes, although you did 20 or 30 years ago. But somehow ageism is still apparently okay.
Well,
and, you know, if to take Joe Biden as an example, if you look at what he's actually doing, so let's look at his outcomes, because it's the outcomes what he's done. He's done a huge amount in terms of his impact as president. So I actually worry about what we're going to see the narrative being over the next few months, because I'm sure it will bring out more ageism. Yeah. And we need to counter that. It's not about age, it's about ability. That's true of any of us at any age. It's never about the chronological age, it's always about ability. But I worry, and I think that's where actually we all have a responsibility to challenge that. If we see that ageist language or those ageist stereotypes, we have a responsibility to challenge that and actually to remind people of, you know, important things like the law and the Equality Act that prevents age discrimination.
I'm going to open it up because loads of things have been rattling in here. I just want to begin with this. Kimberly Lettermore asks this. Lots of talk today, I mean in the conference and yesterday, about what institutions can do for a better future. What's the responsibility of individuals to make a difference? Beth, if I were to ask you that, for individuals, what should they do to make a difference in this question?
Yeah, I've always struggled with that question at times. I think there is individual responsibility, but it's always important not to get into the victim blaming, whereby the victim is given so much responsibility with regards to what they need to be doing. But that also brings me to the awareness that you were talking about. I remember about 3 or 5 years ago, I was working with a community in Leicester where we had actually witnessed the local public health increases in rates of obesity. And I went into a community hall. There was probably about 200 individuals from a specific community with their children, etc. And I started sharing data the way Professor Chris Whitty was sharing data with us. And I'm actually sharing this data with a specific community. And there was almost an uproar, you know, saying, we don't believe that, you know, that cannot actually be us, you know. We don't have those rates of obesity that you're talking about from early childhood. But following the discussion, and we had quite a bit of a discussion where, you know, I said, actually, I didn't come home with these figures. These are public health figures based on the surveys that you've completed. And there was an acceptance by the end of the session. And we started thinking, now, if that is what is going on, what can we do? So that's where the individual responsibility came for me, in the sense that there was almost a lack of awareness of the fact with regards to what was happening within that community. We operate so much in silos that if an individual has got diabetes, you think that you're the only one. You forget that there's actually probably thousands of other people with diabetes. So what can we do? And following that, we got into the co-creation and co-production of producing an Eat Well plan and also a physical activity plan that was very much reflective on the needs of those particular individuals with regards to going forward. Now, that was very much isolated because individual choices also, as we know,
No, carry on.
Yeah, are limited with the choices that they have. You know, social determinants of health is actually really important. So the choices that an individual can make is very much limited with their own socioeconomic class, with the environment that they are, and how we can actually empower that is really important, and taking that into account. So yes, individuals do have a responsibility, but we just need to be careful as practitioners that
mean,
we don't end up into
The interesting point for an economist like you, Andrew, is that if that's true, and if people make decisions that, you know, are quite significant in their own lives, how quickly can public policy and a social attitude change as a consequence of that?
Yeah. And I don't know whether I should answer as an economist or just me, actually. But anyway.
Both.
So this is a huge agenda. So there's an enormous role for individuals, there's an enormous role for companies, and an enormous role for governments.
Yeah.
But it's going to have to be led by individuals. I mean, we're, you know, we're looking at this title of this conference as adding life to years. It's got to be how people want to do it themselves. And, you know, what you may want to do is really different from what I want to do.
It has to come from there in the end.
But of course, what we need is a society that gives people the resources and the capabilities to do it. I actually think social change can happen quite quickly. I think, you know, I'm a great believer in the power of ideas, but I think it's water on a stone, but there comes a point where suddenly when the change happens, it's an S-curve. And we're on a real flat part of the S-curve right now. But once you can sort of shift social norms and social conventions, I think change can happen pretty quickly. Now, I'm not saying that that means every individual has charge of their destiny. They clearly don't. But actually, you know, I think we will see change when it happens quick, but it's going to take a long, long while because, you know, this is a profoundly new part from society where we have to rethink health, for instance. And going back to individual responsibility, we know healthy aging is really about keeping people healthy rather than intervening when they're ill. And that creates a very interesting challenge because that is then going to give a lot of individual responsibility.
Well, if you talk about an S-curve and you look at about the last few years, where are we now? I mean, you know, we talked about the increasing awareness of dementia, for example, and everyone understanding that people are living longer and some of them are living with conditions that we didn't know to the same degree 30 years ago. Where do you think we are on these interlocking curves?
I still think we're on the flat part of the S-curve, but I think more changes happen than we sort of take into account.
Is it a flat bit of an S-curve? Sorry.
So the S-curve is it sort of goes like this. So there's a rapid bit where it's taking off.
I'm vaguely aware of the shape of an S, but I mean...
Well, it's an elongated S. It's a straight
an elongated S.
So we're definitely on the flat part, but I think when change happens, if across society, governments have a big role to play, and governments are weirdly both forward-looking and very short-term. I think individuals lead the way in the first instance, and then politicians respond. I think companies are the ones who are lagging furthest behind in this process. I think they're the ones who haven't really cottoned onto it.
Because one of the points on the green agenda, I mean, I talked not long ago to Kerry, who was Biden's green man, as we all know, ex-Secretary of State. And he said, the interesting thing is if you look at political figures in Washington, we're very slow, in his view, to get on the green thing, and kind of are reluctant because they say some of the people won't like it. He says, well, hang on, the market is ahead of us. And he argues that on that front, the companies have bought it. They said, look, we know where we're going. We're going to get on with it. And the politicians are behind. Now, are you saying on this front, it's the other way around?
Well, I'm not sure. I think governments are given quite a big push with green taxes, the Biden NRA. So, you know, governments say, all of a sudden, I'm going to focus on this. And suddenly firms go, wow, we better switch. And, you know, we had Chris Whitty on here earlier on talking about his chief medical officer who's just done an annual report about healthy aging. So I'm not saying governments are there. Again, they're on the flat part of the S-curve. But I don't see firms responding much in terms of the products they're offering. I don't see firms in terms of workplace practices. There's some people doing it, there's some experimentation, but again, I think they
So what needs to happen?
Well, I think this is partly what the Healthy Aging Challenge all been about, is about bringing together businesses, companies, research, older people to understand this great gift of longer life that we have.
And to say it makes sense to deal with it.
Exactly. It makes sense, and how can we do it? And, you know, I think the countries that really grasp this, that develop products and services and approaches that help us age well, are going to be economically successful because there's a huge export market apart from anything else.
Where is that happening in your view?
In terms of within this country?
No, elsewhere.
I don't know.
Is it a model?
I don't know if there is yet. I think actually some of what we're doing here, and I would absolutely say the Healthy Aging Challenge is at the heart of it, is probably world leading. I know that, you know, recently in the Aging Fit conference in Europe, some of the programs and services and products from here were world leading. So I think we should do all we can actually to celebrate what we're doing well. We do have a tendency, don't we, to sometimes kind of focus on the things we're not doing so well. But actually, I think what the Healthy Aging Programme has shown us is that we have got huge creativity and insight and passion for this. And we've got some services and products and research that I think can be world leading. And we need to get behind it. And we need government and companies to get behind the next phase of this as well.
Andrew, somebody asks anonymously, is there a need for economic experts, I include you in this group, and policymakers to move away from pure GDP as a measure of progress? Is there a need for a measure of social equity? I mean, it's a very fundamental question, isn't it?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I get the question. I mean, to be honest, the idea that any one single number is going to drive policy is stupid, whether it's GDP or a single measure of social equality, because you're going to have to put different weights on all the things that go into social equality. So I think actually you should just look at 3 or 4 important things. And GDP is sort of important because when you've got more resources, it's sort of easier to deal with lots of other problems. I'm not saying GDP is the only thing that matters. I do, however, think that, you know, if I had a magic wand, I would put a healthy life, some measure of healthy life expectancy as a core measure for any government performance. Because if you're getting healthy life expectancy right, you're probably getting everything else right.
Well, people, Layard talked about, you know, happiness indexes and all that.
Happiness is great.
In Denmark.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, of course it does. All these things are important. But again, the notion that you can sort of summarize a nation's happiness in one number, I think is wrong. But if I think about the things that, one of the most valuable things to us, it's our health. And we saw it with COVID, we can see it in this conversation because, you know, I'll be personal. When I was born in 1965, I was a twin and my twin brother died within the first few days. And in working my next book, I was just thinking, well, how common was that? That was the most common age of death in the UK in 1965, less than 1. Now it's like 87. So, you know, what we've done with the health is we focused on infant health challenges, then we focused on midlife challenges, and now we've got to focus on healthy aging. And health is incredibly important to us. So, yes, of course, mental health, physical health, happiness, but I would say healthy life expectancy is a really core indicator. And if we can crack that, then with an aging society, we're doing really well. With the economy, we're probably going to manage it better. So for me, if we were to sort of supplement GDP or elevate one, it would be that one.
Bertha, let me ask you a cheerful question. What have we learned for the better?
What have we learned
in this country? I mean, around the world, but in this country particularly, in the last couple of decades.
I think one of the areas that perhaps I think we've learned a lot, but we underestimate is actually the role of family and friends and those networks that we are operating. And at individual level and at family level, that is really very much celebrated in terms of the role of family and friends and those networks. And we try to do that, even creating friends through LinkedIn, for instance. We know how important those social connections are. And that's something that I think is something that we've learned going forward. And this is because we've seen in the last few years the erosion of those social connections. And that's something that we are now seeking. We are looking at young people also seeking to make sure that that remains. So I think that's something that is very, very important, that you can't even measure. But the impact that it has on an individual's health and life, and when we are looking at older adults, and we are talking about isolation and social isolation and loneliness, how friends and families and those connections that they have is really important.
What's your answer to that? How much have we learned?
Me? So I think we've learnt an enormous amount of things, but I'm going to focus on one thing, actually, and it's about how we make the places where we live help us age well. And the World Health Organization has established a program that's running here and in many other countries called the Age-Friendly Communities Movement. And this is about how we make our environments places where we can get out and about and do the things that matter to us. And it's evidence-based about healthy aging. And what's striking about it is they've identified the 8 domains that you need in order to age well. Only one of those is community support and health. The other is housing and transport and civic engagement and social participation. And there is now a movement across the world and in Wales and in the UK to work with local authorities, older people, community organisations and health services to create these age-friendly communities driven by older people. It's not always expensive. Sometimes it's the really practical things. In fact, Chris Whitty was talking about it, about, you know, sometimes it's about making sure that you can get out of your house and go to the bus stop and there's a bench there along the way so you can make it happen.
Yeah.
So these things are things that are happening now and we can do now. So I think what I've learned is when you're grappling with these huge issues, you need to be looking at the long term. You need to be thinking strategically and politically, but it doesn't stop you getting on and doing stuff that's going to make a difference today. And I think that's partly what this conference has been about for me. It's people getting on and doing stuff that's going to make a difference today, as well as looking at how we can change things into the longer term.
And Andrew, as an economist, I mean, you understand that, don't you? That it's not, you know, having the great picture of policy making in Whitehall or in Cardiff or Edinburgh, wherever it is, but actually doing things that make a difference to people's lives, because that changes the way they behave.
Absolutely. It's all about the implementation. And I think, you know, for me, in the sort of healthy aging space, there's so many people now interested in it. There's so many ideas. But if, you know, and I don't know what the other panelists who are much more expert than I, my slight worry is at some point governments are going to turn around and say, okay, I get this. What do I do and how do I do it tomorrow? And I think we've all got great ideas. I don't know how many things we can say, this is guaranteed to work, you need to do it. So I think it is that focus on implementation that is absolutely key. And I don't know, perhaps you've got ideas that
I think
scale.
I'm probably a bit more optimistic on that, because I think there is good evidence base for quite a lot of interventions and approaches. I think sometimes it's about governments committing to the long term, and sometimes it's about understanding that investment in one area may pay off in another area, and actually having that holistic approach.
And some of them actually quite cheap.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You know, not hugely expensive.
Yeah.
And we know prevention is, you know, some of these old adages are true. Prevention is better than cure.
Yes.
We know prevention works. We know the types of intervention that work, and some of that is about political will, and some of it is also about making sure we, in looking to new solutions, we don't forget to go back and check out actually things that already work.
Yeah.
So sometimes, and I know from when I worked for many years in a charity, funders would often want something new and innovative, but sometimes it's the stuff that we know works.
Just because they did.
Yeah.
Every year, something new.
Yeah, but actually it's about understanding what works and continuing to do that, as well as embracing the new things that we need to do to deal with the new challenges and the opportunities that we have.
Sheila Pierce asks, various people have got questions that have come in here. Some depressing, saying things are going downhill, some very cheerful. Sheila Pierce asks this, if each panelist could have one wish for the next 3 years in the whole field of healthy aging, what would it be? Bertha?
Can I have more than one?
Specific. I know you've got more than one, but keep it to one.
Right. Addressing those factors that increase inequalities in health.
I really want government to start focusing on supporting workers 50 plus. And I think it's the inequality issue again there, where you're going to make an enormous difference to finances, health and social fabric, if you can tackle that.
How quickly would that work in your view? Is it one of those things that could change?
I mean, the full effect would take several years, but I think that's the sort of thing where you could, in 5, 6, 7 years, expect to see an impact on GDP. And I know we talked earlier about GDP being misleading, and I kind of get that.
Yes.
But if you could produce more resources, that would go a long way to then, one of the challenges you've got the public finances is there is no GDP growth at the moment. And that's not just this year, it's a sort of trend since the financial crisis. And there's a German saying, which is that everything tastes better with butter.
Yes.
And that's a little bit for politicians. Everything's easier when you've got more money. And so that's back to the
But the
GDP.
truth is, before I come back to you, we've not got much money. And whether it's this government that survives or another government that comes in, we don't know. But there's going to be a change of government, one form or another, within a year. There's not much room for manoeuvre, is there?
Well, I think there is some room for manoeuvre. I don't think we need to sort of
Not
be
much.
too concerned about government debt. The scope for it to go higher, but of course the key thing is you've got to invest in things that will produce extra output, an investment. And, if you look at the numbers of people, from age 50 to the state pension age 66, there's a bigger fall in employment from 50 to state pension age than at state pension age. If you could half that decline, that's another 500,000 people working. That's a lot of money. And that's not wildly ambitious to try.
How do you do that?
Well, I think there's a combination of focusing on health, it's a focusing on skills, and helping and cracking down on ageist policies. Those three together will help. And firms are going to have to do something on their own as well, because there will be more and more people who are workers of that age and fewer people coming in. So firms are going to have to wake up to this as well. So it's not just the government, firms will also find an incentive as well.
Does that make sense to you?
It does, and I think sometimes we kind of only look at one side of the balance sheet and we don't look at the costs of not doing this, and the costs are massive. Costs in terms of people's own health and well-being, but also costs to the society and the economy. So we do need to talk about, the issue about if we don't take the action, then actually people's lives are going to be worse when they needn't be, but also we'll be poorer as a society and as an economy.
Can I just pick up on that? Because I think it's absolutely key. As an economist, I'm always asked about the GDP impact, which can be positive. But actually, I would spend a fortune to avoid getting dementia. And I would spend money if I get dementia to be cared, but I don't want to get dementia. And so the value of staying healthy is huge, even if it doesn't boost GDP. I think it's really, really important to latch on to that. Health is incredibly important. Healthy aging is very valuable, irrespective of any benefit to GDP.
Could you, any of you, script the front page of the Daily Mail that said that? Silent.
No, I think so, yeah.
What would you, if I'd said to you, if I were editor of the Daily Mail, slightly unlikely, but were I to be editor of the Daily Mail, and I said to you, write me a front page story
Got it.
on, healthy aging,
Yeah.
what would you say?
I'd go with happier, longer lives for all as the headline, and then talk about how we can do that individually and through government policy and investment.
You'd have to sharpen it up a wee bit. But
Yeah,
I
well,
get the point.
I'm not,
Yeah.
James, I'm not a journalist. I thought that wasn't bad.
That's all right.
It wasn't bad for a
No, that's
headline.
fine.
Well, I'm an academic,
Andrew?
so I've got less, but I think it might be a bit ageist, the Daily Mail cover that made the case, but I think it'd be two things. We know that when you show people a picture of themselves age, they go, how can I get that outcome rather than that outcome? And then actually, for all this talk about generational conflict, people care about elderly relatives. And if you say, here's your elderly relative, do you want them to be in this situation or that situation? I think you'd, again, get the same support. So,
Bertha.
I'll probably use one of Professor Whitty's diagram and have that as the front page in terms of looking at the gains that we've made since 1948 and start thinking forward with regards to the impact that we've had since 1948 and the creation of the NHS and what we are about to lose if we don't really protect that social care and health care.
Let me ask all three of you as we wind up, a couple of days of discussion on this subject. We all know that it's deeply important to society. People have been here from government, from local authorities, from charities, from interested bodies of all kinds. What have you learned, Helena?
I've learned a lot from the different presentations and the people I've talked to, but I think the main thing I've learned is about having hope. That there are fantastic people working on a huge range of developments. So we should feel positive. A lot of the answers to the things we've been talking about are in this room. So I think we should not underestimate our ability individually and collectively to really make a difference and to make healthy aging a reality for more of us.
Andrew?
Yeah, well, I pick up on the point you made earlier, which is that don't discount the progress that's been made. It is remarkable, the progress that's been made. It may be daunting what is to come, but there has been remarkable progress for society to be at this point. And then, the other thing, I'm just always amazed at this topic because, I used to work with government debt and things of that form, which are incredibly important. But this is a topic that and you can see how it touches individuals. And I find that's just an incredible blessing to be in a world where you can relate to anyone at an individual level by doing something that is a major social challenge. So I think there's also a little bit a privilege to be involved.
Bertha?
One of the things I've learned, there's a lot of excellent work that is being done regionally, locally, and also nationally. And what I kept asking myself is, are we prepared for these impacts? In a lot of our work, we always talk about pathway to impact. So when you're looking 50 years ago, for probably more than that, did we predict that we would be here today, that we'll be talking and looking at the increases that we've made in longevity? And some of the changes that we are making now, are we really looking forward, looking at what kind of impact that's going to have 50 years later? Or we'll now be thinking, and again, being in a crisis, thinking, what are we supposed to be doing now? So it's about preparing ourselves and always marking those impacts and trying to predict what kind of impact is this going to have for us as a population and generation going forward once we've got these interventions in place. Yeah.
A cheerful and hopeful note on which to end. George is going to come on now. Thank you all very much, and thank you.